Hi, I'm Barbara Bruns from Georgetown University, Center for Global Development, and the RISE Research on Improving Systems of Education program. And I'm going to launch our module on teacher quality with a discussion in two parts. First, talking about the breakthroughs from economics research that have really helped shape our thinking about teacher quality over the last 30 years. And then a short presentation focused on how policymakers think about teacher quality. The point to make about economists thinking about teacher quality is that they don't think about it as a characteristic of the teacher. They think about it as the teacher's impact on students. A teacher effect of a high quality teacher is the ability to increase students' stock of human capital and lifelong productivity. And it's important to note that that's a very broad definition. It's not just ability to increase students' test scores, because what we're after is really an impact on the student's whole life. And actually, it's interesting that the measurement of these impacts on students' socio-emotional development, their skills, their self-belief, their perseverance, a lot of other dimensions are becoming increasingly recognized and increasingly measured. And also we're finding that those have big impacts on students' lifelong productivity. So those are also important teacher effects. But I want to step back to how economists thought initially about education and teachers. First, the first finding from labor market research was that there was an economic payoff to education for individuals from studying the labor market trends and seeing that people with higher levels of education typically earned more. There is also a payoff to countries. Growth economists, macroeconomists trying to do growth accounting, understand why some countries grew faster than others, found that the investments of the country in capital and the investments in labor in terms of years of schooling of the population couldn't fully explain the differential growth rates of different countries. So there was what was called Solo's residual, which he hypothesized was some factor of technological change, innovation, and maybe the quality of the education of the labor force. The bottom line is there's an economic payoff to education for countries and also for individuals. So how to produce education? In the 1980s and 90s, there was a lot of research on the education production function, research trying to correlate education outcomes, attainment, years of schooling completed, and learning as a function of school inputs, like trying to correlate everything. Spending, books, particular investments in infrastructure, particular techniques like flip charts, and of course, looking at teachers' qualification, teachers' education levels, teachers' age, experience, gender, and salaries. And the results were really pretty puzzling, because while the evidence showed that education outcomes broadly rise with GDP per capita, there's a big variance at every level of country income. And economists also found that education outcomes were not consistently correlated with education spending or countries' level of per capita income. For example, Korea and Kuwait spend the same amount on education and had the same GDP per capita, but there were 5 years difference in the level of mastery between sixth grade students in Korea and Kuwait. And similarly, weak correlations between education outcomes and spending, whether across countries or across schools. Or over time, countries like the US doubled their education spending in real terms over a 20-year period, and outcomes, learning levels on the National Assessment of Education Progress remained pretty much flat. So that led people to talk about the black box of the classroom. What was going on that countries could spend and try all the different policies, lowering the pupil-teacher ratio, making investments in infrastructure, and they couldn't consistently produce better education. So the last 25 years has led to some kind of breakthroughs in our ability to analyze these issues and to understand what's going on in the black box of the classroom. Researchers like Eric Hanishek and Raj Chetty and Ludwig Wussmann have created new databases with classroom-level data and cross-country learning data. And there's been a big explosion of experimental evidence from people like Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, and Michael Kramer. I'm going to talk first about the impact of Hanishek and Wussmann's and Chetty's work. Hanishek and Wussmann painstakingly compiled a database with 50 years of test score data from countries across the world, finding ways to equate and compare test score results from various different international tests. And they found that the mystery about why economic growth was not correlated with learning improvement but measured in years of schooling was that a year of schooling in some countries was worth more than others in the amount that their students learned. So student learning results are the principal determinant of the economic returns to education, both for individuals and for countries. And the bottom line is education spending only generates economic growth if it increases student learning. Researchers also started to take advantage of abundant classroom-level data from increases in student testing in the U.S. and started to find that there were big differences in student learning, not just across countries, but across classrooms within a school. They found that the difference between a teacher at the 25th percentile of the distribution of teacher quality and the 75th percentile of distribution could be 0.2 standard deviations higher math performance for that teacher's students. So, and Hanishek's work showed that students with a weak teacher might only master 50% of the curriculum in a year. Students with an average teacher would get through the curriculum, and students with a great teacher would do a year and a half's worth of learning in a single school year. And they also, very importantly, found that these differences in teachers' impact on students' learning could not be predicted by observable characteristics of teachers, like how many years of education the teacher herself had, what kind of degree the teacher had, whether it was male or female, how old the teacher was. And those are typically the ways that countries and school systems hire their teachers based on those formal qualifications. And a really important study that kind of dwarfed all of the previous research in its ambition and its impact is the work by Chetty, Friedman, and Rockoff in 2013, 2014. Using massive amounts of data, they analyzed data for over 2 million students for from 5 grades of primary school. They were able to map each student to every teacher that student had in their primary schooling, analyzed 18 million test scores, and followed the students for 20 years. And this enabled them to look precisely at how much individual students learned depending on which teacher they were assigned to. And because they could control for students' prior test scores, they could fairly attribute any gains in learning over the course of a school year to the work of that particular teacher. And what they found was the data source was the data file was so huge, they were able to identify a subset of classrooms where teachers had actually changed at the beginning of the school year from one year to the next. So in this huge pool of schools and classrooms, they were able to do a quasi-experiment. They were able to identify those classrooms where there was a change in teacher from one year to the next. And they were able, within that pool, to isolate those classrooms where the change had been particularly dramatic. A low-performing teacher replaced by one of the teachers in the top 5% of the distribution, and conversely, a case where a high-performing teacher had been replaced by a teacher from the bottom of the distribution. And in those situations, you can assume that the school conditions stay the same, the socioeconomic level of the students stay the same, and that you're controlling for the students, those particular students' prior levels of learning. So it's legitimate to attribute the change in learning over that school year to the change in the teacher. So, and they were able to isolate the impact on the classroom performance from a dramatic change, a switch in teacher from a high-performing teacher to a low-performing teacher, and vice versa. Interestingly, they also studied the long-term effects of these teachers' impacts on students by combining the school classroom data with income tax returns from the families and the students themselves as they got older. And they found important long-term effects on students. They found that children exposed, it's kind of mind-boggling, but children exposed to even one highly effective teacher from the top 5% of the distribution during their primary school years were significantly more likely to attend college, to go to a better college, to earn higher incomes, to have a higher savings rate, to avoid teenage pregnancy, and avoid incarceration. It was interesting to find that sometimes the specific learning gains would fade out, but the positive life outcomes persisted. So when I had the chance to lead a research program on teacher quality in Latin America, we obviously didn't have access to the kind of test score data that Chetty and his co-authors had. So we tried to find other ways to try to study differences in teachers' practice. And we used standardized classroom observations using a very simple classroom snapshot that would code what the teacher's doing at 10 evenly spaced intervals per class. And we ended up doing it in 6 different countries in 18,000 different schools, 18,000 different teachers, almost 4,000 different schools. And what we found was very similar to what Chetty found, that there were big variations in teacher practice across, but it's also mind-blowingly within schools. Within every single school, you saw this big variation. You could have a top-performing teacher and a low-performing teacher in the same school. And think about it, those are schools that will be the same neighborhood, dealing with the same students, and sometimes there's tracking of students into more advanced classes. But this measure of how the teacher used time, what instructional techniques they used, how effective they were in keeping the students engaged, showed this incredible variation within a school. And just as Chetty's study found that 85% of the variation in teacher value added is within schools, we found 80% of the variation in teacher practice was found within schools as well. So just to give 2 examples of teachers that look the same on paper. If you're a minister or a secretary hiring teachers, these 2 teachers both had the same level of teacher preparation, the same licenciatura agree, the same age, same years of experience teaching. And if you see from the videos that the classroom experience of their students is completely different. So this is the reality of most school systems. I should say all school systems. There's large variation in teacher effectiveness across the system and within schools. And it's true whether you measure teacher effectiveness through teacher value added, student test score gains, or observable measures of their classroom practice. And these variations in teacher effectiveness are not correlated with formal qualifications or observable characteristics, their age, the years of teaching, their formal qualifications, etc. So the bottom line is that this explosion of research from cross-country learning data and classroom level learning data has really helped explain the black box of why schooling inputs and spending don't always translate into learning. And it's produced evidence that the individual teachers are the strongest school level determinant of student learning, and evidence that there's a huge range in teacher effectiveness, and evidence that the difference in teachers' effectiveness are not easy to tell ex ante by their observable qualifications. And all of this translates into a big challenge for teacher policy. Adding to the challenge is the fact that high-quality teachers are produced by a system, and system-wide reforms are hard to study experimentally. There's no counterfactual. So we have relatively little research evidence to guide teacher policy, and teacher policy has high political stakes. Thank you.